NYPD is facing a number of criticisms this week as we enter the next chapter in the coronavirus pandemic, from how it's handled the unrest in the Orthodox and Hasidic communities to its failure to enforce its policy requiring officers to wear masks on the street. Joining us now to dig deeper into what exactly is happening here is former NYPD Assistant Commissioner of Training and Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice at St. John's University, Dr. Rob Gonzalez. Dr. Gonzalez, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So, Doctor, let's start with the unrest happening this week in the Hasidic and Orthodox communities. Take a look at some of this video. It shows unruly crowds of mostly unmasked men protesting on the streets. We saw this last night. We saw this the night before. Cameras have captured 3 incidents of photographers being accosted, surrounded, even attacked by people. Also caught on camera, protesters setting a fire here in the street. However, police tell us the protests were peaceful and that no arrests were made. When you look at this, what is your reaction?
Well, the police usually take a hands-off approach when it comes to dealing with the Hasidic community. They usually go unchallenged, unchecked by the NYPD. Clearly, there's criminality that we see in this video. And what we're hearing from witnesses and even people from the media who stated that, they've been victimized by the Hasidic community. But once again, public safety needs to be enforced regardless of religion, race, ethnicity, and even social class. And we see in this video that that's not actually happening.
Well, let's dig into that. I want to get into why it's a hands-off when it comes to the Orthodox and Hasidic communities, but not exactly when it comes to black and brown communities. We saw those protesters treated much differently during the protests after the death of black men at the arms of police. So what are your thoughts? Do you believe this to be true, that it's a slippery slope when it comes to the Orthodox and Hasidic community?
Yeah, it pretty much is a slippery slope. Again, since the beginning of time, there's always been a hands-off approach, and there's always been a perception that there's a backdoor relationship between the Hasidic community and City Hall, and even the NYPD that's more favorable than other communities, even right next door. And a lot of times it's the perception that once you get the endorsement from the Hasidic community, you're almost guaranteed an elected position.
But the NYPD is not an elected office.
Yes, but they're the face of government. And unfortunately, they have relationships in City Hall that they must actually accommodate and actually communicate well with. So again, you need a pipeline, through the NYPD to City Hall. And again, that's an actual relationship. And I know the NYPD tries to have relationships with all communities, but the Hasidic community is one that you absolutely need to have, or there's backlash that usually trickles down from City Hall.
So in these same neighborhoods, sir, Mayor de Blasio announced that starting today, the NYPD would be enforcing rules, including $15,000 fines for mass gatherings, as much as $1,000 fines for failing to wear a mask. How do you see this playing out on the streets? How will the NYPD officers handle this?
Well, I think they have their hands full. It's going to be a very delicate issue, again, because certain communities are policed differently. So I'd like to see, I want a seat at the front seat of this circus that's about to take place, because there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be complaining about how this is only enforced in certain neighborhoods. So
how do you go about actually training a police officer to deal with this, right? Because in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw the NYPD going after some members who weren't wearing masks. Some people were thrown to the ground in some instances as well. How do you train an officer to go about it?
Well, usually you need adequate supervision, right? So the first people you need to get on board are the first line supervisors, so they can monitor and supervise. And usually when we look at most cases of police brutality, there usually isn't a supervisor on the scene. So I'm guessing that the NYPD at this point is educating their frontline supervisors to get their police officers on board so that they can equally enforce this policy in various communities.
So, and the NYPD has been challenged with enforcing really its own mask policy within the department, and that despite more than 150 reported complaints, no officers have been reprimanded for failing to wear one. So I wanted you to take a listen to what the commissioner had to say about this earlier this week.
I think it's something that has improved. When you talk about, mask wearing of the officers, can you find an officer? Absolutely. I think you can find someone in basically any walk of life across the New York City in multiple jobs not wearing masks, but we take it very seriously. And that was the message that we tried to push out last week. Because
do you feel, when you look at this, that the NYPD, and listening to that the NYPD is doing enough to make sure its own officers are setting an example for the community that they're about to go out and find?
I agree with the commissioner. It's a very delicate and difficult thing to enforce across the board. But they do remind officers that it's their own personal safety that's at risk. So they encourage them to wear it, not only for the community's sake, but only for the officer's sake. But like any industry, it's very hard to enforce, regardless of what occupation you're in. But law enforcement should try to abide by it for their own safety and the safety of the public.
Understood. Dr. Rob Gonzalez, do appreciate you and your time this morning and your perspective on these important topics.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.